Welcome to this lesson of the Polgar Chess University. In this lesson, we will discuss about the space advantage, distant opposition in pawn endgames, and of course, as usual, we end with miracles in chess. The first position we see on the board is from a real game, in fact it's a famous game, from a match being played between one of my all-time favorite players, Garry Kasparov as white, and the famous German grandmaster Robert Hübner. It's quite clear that white's position is more spacious, and the way we can determine that is that while most of the pawns are pretty balanced, the d5 pawn of white is more ahead than black's d6 pawn. So therefore, black is more restricted in his maneuvering. Also, we can notice the difference between the two knights on the board. While white's knight on a4 is very active and is the dominant one, attacking the pawn on b6, black's knight on a8 is the one defending. However, usually one weakness is not enough to lose a game. There needs to be more than one target. And that's what we're going to see, that white combines a couple of different threats and then black is unable to respond to all of them timely. Let's see how the game continued. Kasparov played here f takes g5 and Hübner recaptured with the f pawn, which is the better way. If black would capture with the h pawn, white would just push through with h5 and create a protected passed pawn. The reason why that's such a great thing is because it ties down black's king. It needs to stay in the vicinity of the white pawn, making sure it doesn't become a queen on the h file. And at the same go, it frees up white's king to go around to the queen's side because the g4 pawn eternally protects that pawn on h5. So, getting back to the actual game, black captured with the f pawn. And here, an important move, white pushed through and gained more space advantage, and even more importantly, created another target in black's position. We can already see the weakness of the f5 square where it would be fantastic to get the knight to. And we can see it's not so out of touch. Actually, the knight has a very nice route to get there in the foreseeable future. In the meantime, black's knight is totally stuck, protecting the pawn on b6. Black played king to e7, and white was ready for the knight maneuver. There are several ways to get there and accomplish our goal. And Kasparov played knight to c3. And of course, white can get there in this route or potentially in some other ways as well, like e2, g3, and f5. So there are many ways to get there. Black continued with knight to c7. So white played knight to d1, aiming to the critical f5 square, and black played knight to e8. Knight to e3 and knight to g7, just on time. Now, if the white knight indeed jumps to f5, that's not the same story anymore, because after the exchange of knights, after either white pawn recaptures, black will also have a protected passed pawn, and the game would be a draw. White cannot make progress, because if the king would try to walk over to the queen side, it will not be able to actually go after black's pawn, because then black's e-pawn would march down. So let's get back a couple of moves, and instead of knight f5, this was the moment when Kasparov got ready to swing the king over to the queen side and played king e2. Black is going there to defend as well. And now b4, temporary pawn sacrifice. Of course, white is not afraid of black capturing that pawn, because after king b3, the pawn would be lost immediately. Black responded by playing king to c7, king b3, king b7, king a4. So now we can see that the white king simply wants to come around to b5 and kind of put black in a zugzwang. Now black has a number of ways to play. Of course, if he moves a knight, that would allow the white knight to jump into f5 and simply pick up that pawn on h6. But what would happen if in this position black plays king a6, preventing white's king from getting into b5? Well, then already white, based on tactics, is ready to trade knights, because after knight f5, knight takes, the g-pawn takes, g4, and yes, the two pawns arrive to the promotion square pretty much at the same time. But sadly for black, the game ends right away after checkmate in the corner. Let's go back to the game position, and after king a4, black played king b8. What would happen if instead black would trade pawns first? The king would recapture, let's say king b8, king b5, king b7. And now again, white gets a winning pawn endgame after the exchange of knights, but this time the e-pawn is the one that recaptures. Now, for example, if king c7, f6, king d7, and white can bravely capture the pawn despite the fact that the black pawn is running, c5. Now white has two passed pawns that are running. After pawn takes, f7, king e7, and d6. King takes pawn, d7, king e7, and king c7, and white arrive first. Let's go back, a couple of more moves. After the immediate trade on f5, what happens if black does not play king c7, but pushes his pawn immediately with e4? Then again, both sides promote their pawns to a queen. Comes queen f7 check, and then black's king will get checkmated real quick on b7. Let's get back to the actual game. In fact, there was no trade on b4, so the game got to this position, and here, as we said, king a6 lost because after the knight trades on f5, white took with the g pawn, and when the two pawns promoted, white checkmated in a corner. When black traded on b4, then after the knights got traded, white took with the e pawn. It of course requires exact calculation, as we've seen in the sample variations. And finally, let's see the actual game move, which was king to b8. And now white followed by trading on c5. Black recaptured with the b pawn and played king a5. Again, an important trick, inviting the opposition with king a7, which did not happen in the game. In that case, white would again offer the trade of knights, take with the g pawn. Both pawns get pushed in, get promoted. White first, which makes, of course, quite a difference who promotes first. Of course, notice it would be a big blunder to capture the pawn on h6 right now, because out of nowhere it would be black who checkmates, not on a5. That was just a mouse slip. Queen a6, of course, and checkmating the king. But naturally, white would not even think of capturing that pawn on h6, but the correct move is to check on e7, king b8, and use the king as an attacking piece on b6, and then hide behind black's pawn on c6, and black is quite helpless, at least losing kind of all the middle pawns or even getting checkmated, depending how black continues. One more time, let's get back to the actual game and a couple of more moves back. So in this position, Grandmaster Hübner responded with king b7, and then black is kind of simply losing the opposition, just as if the position would be a pawn endgame, an endgame with pawns only. King c7, king a6, and if the black king would just keep moving away, then similarly to a pawn endgame, white would be winning. Or actually king c6, even more accurate. Therefore, after king b7, finally black decided to look for some counterplay and played knight e8, allowing knight f5, knight f6, and knight captures on h6, knight e4. Well, at least black also created a pass pawn, but it's less advanced than white's, h6, e4. And now white simply can regroup the king, move it back all around, come back to e3, and then attack the pawn again and win the pawn. White played king b6, continued knight h7, king b5, and basically after the king got a little bit closer, for example, knight f6, king a4, black simply will get into Zugzwang. Of course, black cannot capture this pawn ever, because then the h-pawn runs away. In the meantime, black's king is stuck, protecting the pawn on d6. So therefore, there's not much that black can do from the white king marching to b3 and then to e3 and pick up that pawn on e4. Well, after this instructive endgame, to show how space advantage is even important in endgames, I'd like to share with you one of my favorite games of all times. That was a crucial game, the very last game of the Classical World Championship that I won in 1996 against the Chinese former world champion Xi Jun. We reached this position just after 16 opening moves, And again, we're having a queenless middle game here. I had the white pieces, and my pawn on c4 is under attack at the moment. We can see that white's pawns are in a more advanced position than black's, and typically that's the sign for space advantage. Here, in addition, black has some difficulties with the bishop on c8. I continued by pawn takes pawn back, and bishop d6, an important move to minimize the black rook's mobility. Came rook e8 and c5. As you can see, this bishop on d6 pretty much ties down any potential activity along the d file for either back rook, and at the same time it's guarding an important square on b8, the other open file, from black's rooks. After c5, the response was knight to c4 and e5, cementing in that bishop on d6, and at the same time minimizing again the mobility, the activity of black's bishop on g7. Of course, I'm not very worried about black capturing my bishop, trading the knight for the bishop, because that would create a protected passed pawn. Again, that's a theme that we saw over and over in the previous example in the Kasparov game. Black continued with bishop a6, trying to develop, and now simply rook f to c1. Black has major problems here, and the next move speed up things even more than it would be otherwise. That's not to say that, let's say, for example, after knight d6, which would have prevented the loss of significant material, would have saved the game, because then the pawn on c6 would be lost very, very soon, and white's advantage is quite significant here as well. My opponent made a mistake by playing rook e to c8, trying to defend the weak c6 pawn, but that allows a pin by bishop to f1. I always stress the point how dangerous it is to keep pieces on unprotected squares, because whether let it be a pin or a fork or a discovery, it's the cause of most major material losses. In this position, if black captures the bishop on d6, I do not capture the knight back, but the bishop on a6, creating a dual attack on black's rook and knight. My opponent played knight to e5, and now, on the other hand, instead of taking the bishop, it's better to take the knight, and simply white is up a knight, and my opponent resigned. Let's change the subject for a moment and talk about some important pawn endgames. This is a very basic pawn endgame, and it's black to move in this position. What do you think? Can black save this game, or is it just hopeless and should black resign? Well, this is a famous example of distant opposition. Normally, the defensive side's goal should be to be kind of in front of the passed pawn, but not in this case. In this case, a move like king c6 would be losing, because it would allow white to gain the opposition. The only correct move here is to keep the distant opposition by king d7, to be able to answer king d4 with king d6, or king c4 with king c6. And then, the usual way, black has no problem to hold the game to a draw. The only important point is that when the pawn already reached the 6th rank in this juncture, the king needs to go to the middle to be flexible, to respond on either side that the white king would go to, and then the game, of course, ends in a draw. Let's see a more complex example of the distant opposition. In this position, it's white's turn. I suggest you take a couple of minutes and try to figure out what the correct move is here for white. The most natural moves here are trying to go after black's pawn. However, that's not the right move. In that case, black would play king d1, and after king b4, king c2. After king captures pawn, king captures pawn. And after king c5, just on time, black succeeds to advance the pawn and promote it soon. So going after black's b5 pawn immediately certainly fails. How about trying to keep black's king away by playing king c1? Well, then black would play king e2, king c2, followed by king e3. Now, white's problem is the king cannot continue keeping the opposition by king c3 because of his own pawn being there. And after king b2, black would gain opposition. White would have to stay near the pawn, keep it protected, and then the king goes to c1, king b4, king c2, and as we've seen in the previous variation, after the exchange of the b5 and c3 pawn, black wins. So what could be the solution? There is only one correct move here, and a very surprising one at it. It's king a1, and this is what's called distant opposition. When we are talking about distant opposition, there are either 3 or 5 squares in between the two kings, and the two kings are always on the same color squares. If king d1, king b1, king d2, king b2, king d3, king b3. And black cannot make progress. After d4, for example, white would capture, king b4, and it's an obvious draw. Again, remember, as an idea, distant opposition. Always odd number of squares in between the two kings. And finally, let's see a brilliant combination. A very similar position has been played between the legendary Frank Marshall in 1912 against Master Levitsky. But in that game, white did not have a bishop on e4. I figured it's a more interesting, more realistic position when there is material balance in the game. In fact, in this moment, the black queen is under attack, so is the black rook on h3. So in reality, black seems to be in serious trouble. Well, let's look at the most obvious move. Let's give a check. Well, then after king h1, black still needs to face those very same problems, namely that the queen and the rook are under attack. The best black can do at this point is to give perpetual checks by knight g3, and after king g1 repeat moves with knight e2 check. Capturing the bishop on e4, on the other hand, would be a blunder, because after both sides take queens, white ends up ahead. So what should black do? Try to figure out this brilliant move. I bet you'll like it. Well, hopefully you found it and you liked it. I really certainly think it's one of the most brilliant ideas of all chess games I've ever seen. Queen to g3. Look at that move. The queen can be captured by two different pawns or by the queen, and they all lose. Well, if the h-pawn captures, game ends right away with knight e2. If the f-pawn captures, well, takes just one move longer, knight e2 check, king h1, and the back rank checkmate by rook takes f1. So after the brilliant queen g3 move, that of course threatens to checkmate with queen h2, relatively the best response is to capture with the queen. Of course now, if rook takes, white again is happy winning a rook after pawn takes queen. But that wasn't black's plan. Black's plan is to check now, force the white king into the corner, into the pin along the h-file, and now, of course, knight takes on g3. Check. The f-pawn is pinned, cannot capture, because it would be immediate back rank checkmate, so the only move is to play king to g1, and now black simply captures that bishop on e4. True, the black rook is hanging on h3, but so is white's rook on c5. Well, the story is not quite over yet. White can try to move the rook away, attacking black's knight, while the rook on h3 is still hanging. For example, if knight being attacked from c4, rook c4, then black has two ways to escape, either by knight d6, again counter-attacking the rook, and after rook d4, knight f5, and then the rook is free. Or there is even a cuter way to deal with the problem and play rook e3, protect the knight, thanks to a cute simplification combination, and then regain the rook by a fork. And finally, if white's rook in this position, instead of c4, goes to e5, attacking the knight, then rook h4 protects, g3, and now again, luckily for black, knight d2, and after pawn takes rook, the final fork, and at the end of the day, black is a knight ahead. Well, I hope you enjoyed this brilliant combination, the very instructive pawn endgames, as well as the interesting knight endgame that Kasparov played. Hope to have you back next week. So long until then.